Hello and welcome back. sleepywhatsit here, and I have another miniatures video for you. In today's video, we're going to continue my series of tutorials for Games Workshop's easy build models and paint sets. Specifically, we're going to be covering the Nighthaunt Paint Set today. If you're not familiar with these kits, they contain a number of easy build push-fit models, some paints, and a starter brush to help you get going in the hobby. They're intended for beginners that don't have much experience or supplies that want to try painting some miniatures. I personally don't think the minimal instruction that is provided with these kits is sufficient for a beginner, so I decided to make a walkthrough to show new hobbyists how to use the kits. I have previously covered their Primus Intercessor and paint set, and their Death Guard and paint set. I'll put a link to those videos down below in the description if you want to view them. I have also produced an overview/review video for the entire series of kits, which I'll put a card up for now, and a link down below. The overall format of this video will be similar to the previous ones in the series, where I'm going to review what comes in the box, and then we're going to do a walkthrough of actually painting the models with some suggestions on how to improve and what you've painted and next steps to take. If you already have some of the elements of this kit, like some paint pots or a brush or even the models, then it's probably not worthwhile buying the entire kit. You can just pick up the pieces that you're missing for probably less than buying an entire additional kit. Before we get into the rest of the video, I just want to briefly introduce to you or remind you of the markers that I put in these videos. I'll place these at points that if you're actively painting, that you can pause the video and go complete the step that I just described. They look something like this. I will put timestamps in the description below so that you can easily jump between different stages in the painting process. So now let's get into it. So here we have the kit. Taking a look under the front flap here, you can see the limited instructions that I referred to before. If you're familiar with miniature painting, you probably can figure out what is intended from these instructions, but I suspect they're a bit cryptic and sparse for a new painter. Let's open up the box and see what comes in it. First, we have the two plastic frames called sprues that contain the 4 Glaivewraith Stalkers and their bases that we'll be painting with this kit. Next, we have the starter brush that was provided. This isn't the greatest brush in the world, but it's serviceable for this and other beginner projects. And now on to the paint that we've been provided with. The first paint that we have here is Celestra Grey, which is a cool off-white/grey base paint that we'll be using to undercoat the entire model. Next, we have a small pot of Nighthaunt Gloom. This will be used to give a spooky ethereal feel to various elements of the model. Normally when you purchase this paint, it comes in a larger container, but this is a sufficient amount for these models. All of these paints should be shaken before using since they tend to separate, but Nighthaunt Gloom is particularly prone to separation, so we'll need a good shake before you start painting with it. Here we have Rhinox Hide, which is a deep brown with some reddish tones to it. This is going to be used for painting the halves of our model's weapons, as well as lots of the base details. Now we have Incubi Darkness, which is a very dark, almost black, tealy green paint that will be used for the cowl/cloaks on the models and some of the details on the bases. Here we have our gray metallic paint, Leadbelcher, which will be used for the glaive blades and some of the details like fences and gates that appear on the bases. And finally, we have our shade, Reikland Fleshshade, which comes in a smaller pot than the standard store size, like the Nighthaunt Gloom, but in keeping with the rest of the kit's size of pots. This is a brown-red shade that's normally used for shading skin, but is also good for adding a rust effect on metals. There are a number of tools and supplies that are not provided in this kit that I think are essential for actually assembling and painting the models. I have previously made a separate video for the original Intercessors tutorial that I did that covers all of these extra supplies. Instead of padding out this video by repeating myself on the topic, I'll put a link card up here and down below in the description so you can go and review it if you haven't seen it already. This video also covers assembly of push-fit models, and broadly this can be applied to assembling these models. The only major difference with these models is that instead of having a tab model that goes into a slotted base, we instead have a molded base that uses more of a push-fit system to stick together like the rest of the model. I'm going to include here a short time-lapse of me building one of the Glaivewraiths so you can see how I tackled it for these specific models and any subtle differences from the Space Marines. If you're actively following along, you should pause the video now, and if you need to review the video I linked, and then assemble your models, since I'm going to proceed assuming that you have fully assembled and prepped models. So now we have our prepped and assembled Glaivewraith Stalker model, so we can start getting into painting. The first stage that we're going to do is base coating the entire model with Celestra Grey to establish an undercoat for the entire model. Celestra Grey is not a primer, but just a base paint, so I would have preferred to have primed using a light gray beforehand to make sure the paint doesn't rub off later, but the kit doesn't come with primer, so I'm not going to assume that you have any available. We're going to be following the advice of Duncan, formerly of Warhammer TV, here for the base by applying it in 2 thin coats. This means that the paint that we're applying should be thinned enough with water that it will require 2 coats to get complete coverage. This will allow it to be applied smoothly and not have any brush strokes showing through on it. You don't want it so thin that it runs and starts to pool on your model, but what we're really trying to avoid is any type of paint strokes showing up in the paint. It does require some time to develop a good feel for exactly how much thinning you need to do, so you may not get it perfectly your first try. You're going to want to paint the entire model and then let it dry. It is fine if at this stage there's still some plastic gray showing through in areas like where it's pointy and such. Now you can pause the video and apply your first coat of Celestra Grey. So here we have our model with the first layer of Celestra Grey applied to it and dried. At this point we've made our model a lighter shade of gray that still needs some cleanup. We've done this to establish an undertone for the rest of our painting and give some of the paints like the Nighthaunt Gloom something to adhere to. If we have our base coat thin enough, we should have gone a nice smooth application here, but there might be some dark spots in the paint job showing through from the darker plastic underneath. We're now going to be applying a second thin coat, paying close attention to those dark patches, making sure that they've been covered this time. You should now pause the video and apply your second layer of Celestra Grey. Now that we've put down a second layer of Celestra Grey, our model should look something like this. Light gray all over with no dark patches showing through. The next paint that we're going to be applying is our Nighthaunt Gloom. Nighthaunt Gloom is from GW's technical line and behaves something like between a standard base layer paint and a shade. It is more flowy than a standard base paint, but is not as watery as a shade. Its standard use is to apply to an area to tint it a blue-gray color, but adding some texture and contrast to the paint at the same time. You're going to want to apply it like a base paint, covering the entire area, and then letting it settle into the shape of the model to create a bit more depth and dimension. If it's going on a little bit too thick and not really settling out, you may need to thin it with a bit of water. Nighthaunt Gloom is a bit of a tricky paint to get a handle on. I'm not sure if I would have put in a beginner's kit, to be honest, but you can get some pretty neat effects with it with limited effort, and it's kind of essential for painting Nighthaunts. The instructions, and what I'm demoing here, have the Nighthaunt Gloom applied to the entire model. For areas like the glaive haft and blade, I don't think this is strictly necessary, since we are going to be applying additional base paints to this later and kind of obliterating the Nighthaunt Gloom. For the cowl/cloak, depending on how you apply the Incubi Darkness later, the Nighthaunt Gloom can potentially create some neat effects to it. You should now pause the video and apply Nighthaunt Gloom to your model. Make sure to let it dry entirely before proceeding with the next step. Here we have the model after letting the Nighthaunt Gloom dry. It has a distinctive ethereal, spooky texture to it, giving it the impression of not being entirely here. The next paint that we're going to apply is Rhinox Hide. This is a relatively heavily pigmented paint, so even thinned for this application, you may get away with a single layer. It really depends on your taste in some spaces. This is the part of the kit where I disagree a bit with how they applied the paint. I'll demo it here as depicted in the instructions, but I'm also going to include a bonus section at the end of the video where I'm going to show you basically how I would have painted the model. The instructions have you painting the entire haft of the glaive brown, which I totally agree with. But then they have you painting the entire base this dark chocolatey brown color, which is the part I kind of disagree with. You should pause the video now and apply some Rhinox Hide to your model. Once we've let the Rhinox Hide dry, we should end up with a model that looks something like this. Next, we're going to be painting the cowl/cloak of the model. We're going to be using Incubi Darkness here to give it a dark green, almost black look. If you only apply a single thin coat and don't actively try and even it out, you can let some of the Nighthaunt Gloom underneath show through, and this can add some nice texture to the appearance of the cowl. If you're wanting a more clean, flat appearance to the cowl, then you should just do the standard 2 layers to get full coverage. You can also use the green hue of the Incubi Darkness to pick out some of the leaves on the base for a bit more detail and interest there. Don't get too fussed if the green doesn't show up super well. The Rhinox Hide and the Incubi Darkness have a similar value. Value being the property of a paint or color of how close it is to a pure white or black. Since these two paints have very similar values because they're very dark, it's going to be difficult to establish a good contrast, but it is better than nothing. Now you should pause the video and go paint some Incubi Darkness on your model. Here's my version of the model after I let the Incubi Darkness dry. Now I'm going to apply Leadbelcher to the blade of the glaive to give it the look of steel. If you've decided to paint one of the models with a bit of fence or grating on the base, you should apply Leadbelcher here also. You should pause the video now and go apply some Leadbelcher. After letting the Leadbelcher dry, we should have some nice metallic details on our model like this. Now we're going to apply some Reikland Fleshshade to the model. Specifically, we'll be applying it to the blade to give it a rusted old look. If you have other metallic areas on the base, feel free to hit it with some of the shade too. I also applied it to the base of the model, trying to establish some more detail/contrast to the brown color we have there. Now you should pause the video and shade your model. Once we have allowed the shade to dry, we should have a model that looks something like this. According to the instructions, this is a completed model. This, I think, is a decent first model, but I think there's a few things we could do to improve it, given the supplies we've been provided with. The first thing I'm going to do to improve this model is doing a bit of highlighting on the metal. Specifically, I'm going to get a bit of Leadbelcher on my brush and use the side of the brush to brighten up some areas of the metal. I'm going to hit the cutting edge of the blade and some of the points on the back, because these are the areas that would have either been sharpened or rubbed from usage to remove the rust. If you're doing a base that has fences or gates, you can also hit the top edges of that with this Leadbelcher to establish that there's a bit of light coming down from above. The next bit of work I did used Celestra Grey. I went in and added it to the skull and hands of the model to establish some distinction between them and the rest of the body of the figure. If you don't go for full coverage, the underlying Nighthaunt Gloom peeking through can give a nice spectral feel. I also went in on the base and picked out the skulls. I would have preferred to have a more yellowy off-white to do the bone, but we only have the Celestra Grey to work with here. The final bit of improvement I did on the model here was using a bit of thinned Nighthaunt Gloom. I used this to darken some of the upper parts of the trailing spectrally bits on the model up near the cowl. If you wanted to push the contrast even further and lighten up the ends, you could have dry brushed some of the Celestra Grey onto the ends. But we weren't really provided with a proper dry brushing brush, and it's definitely not a technique used anywhere else in the instructions, so I'm not actually going to do it here. So after going in and doing the detail work I described, this is what my model looks like. As I mentioned while we were working, there were some color choices in the instructions that I disagreed with. What I'm going to show next is an alternative version of the Stalker that I did using the same components from the kit, but with some slightly different color placements. So for this model, I did the majority of the main model in the same fashion as the instructions from the kit. The two major changes that were made were with the skull/arms on the body of the model itself, and the stone on the base. For the body elements, instead of putting down a layer of Nighthaunt Gloom over the Celestra Grey and then having to repaint that with the gray as I did originally, I just made sure not to get the gloom onto those areas. I also used Reikland Fleshshade on these areas to give them a little bit more shade and detail, and then did some light highlighting using Celestra Grey. On the bases, the major change that I did was not going whole ham with the Rhinox Hide all over the base. Instead, I focused putting the Rhinox Hide on the areas that were like vines and obvious dirt piles. And the rest of the stone and bone I did using Celestra Grey. If I had another gray color to work with, I would have done stone in one and the skulls in another, but we have to work with what we have. Then for the stone and bone areas, I used Reikland Fleshshade again to do some shading and did some highlighting similar to how I did with the arms and skull on the body. This by far isn't a perfect Nighthaunt because I would really love to have a slightly larger palette to work with to get some more distinction, but I think it is a better looking version of the model than what was depicted by the kit, because I really didn't like how that full chocolatey base thing was looking. So that kind of concludes the main instructional portion of the video. So I guess some next steps. I personally recommend painting the rest of the models in this kit because with miniature painting, a large portion of the skills that are necessary to improve come from actually physically doing the task. Like, you can listen to me explain how to do something, you can watch people do it, but you really have to develop the fine motor control and just the natural feel for a lot of these tasks. So I think completing the rest of this kit is a good first step. If you're not particularly set on painting Nighthaunts, but you want to play Age of Sigmar or 40k, as I said, there are the 3 other kits in this series that you could try out. I fully recommend them. I have videos for 2 of them and hopefully for the 3rd one at some point in the future that you can go watch. If you're wanting to play Nighthaunts especially, there's a number of different paints that you could add and expand your palette. There's a lot of good guides online on how to paint Nighthaunts. For collecting and building an army, you're probably going to want to get the Nighthaunt half of the Soul Wars box, just because there's a number of unique units that are not actually available separately from that. They're kind of important for building a Nighthaunt army. And just generally get comfortable painting a crap ton of chain rasps, since most competitive Nighthaunt lists are really built on lots and lots of chain rasps. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give the video a like. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. I try to put out new miniatures videos on tutorials or reviews of stuff every couple of weeks. If you want to see the type of stuff that I'm actively working on for videos or for personal projects, I do stream on Twitch under sleepywhatsit, and you can see me paint some stuff there. Other than that, I'll see you in the next one.